This is my story. On June 6, 1944, on Omaha Beach, I was on WN 62. I am Franz Gokel. The yell words alert screaming inside our bunker. Awake us
Brigade
one by
Satuna!
one. A comrade
Sevgelin!
standing up by the entrance shot again to make sure there is no misunderstanding. Highest alert level. He pushed us up to hurry up, but during the past day, so often we were taken out of our sleeping coach. That did not have much effect. Some of us changed side in their bed and went back to sleep. Yet our comrade was still in the door. NCO Forrester shows us behind and says, "Guys, this is serious. They arrived. Z coming." The famous Z coming. Hoping it will never happen, did happen. Like one man, we urged all together, taking our rifle, we were running to our heavy guns. All of Charing was forgotten. Machine guns, cannon, and mortars of all calibers were loaded, ready to fire. We were now near our weaponry. So far, the night looked like many others, but suddenly the first message arrived from our HQ. In Sainte Mère-Église is the aerial corridor about 20 miles west of Colleville-sur-Mer, our position in the Cotentin Peninsula between Cherbourg and Carrington. Troops were parachuted. A naval armada apparently left the southern ports of England. On their way to Normandy, nothing was obvious on our sector, quite so far. Was that another false alert? Time was going slowly. Is that will become serious at all? We were dressed in our light and thin uniforms. We were so cold that our body was shaking. Our cook served warm wine, and our survival instinct took over. As we were working the previous day on excavating and digging, this is what we were supposed to do also today, and we were pretty much ready to go back to bed once again. Oh, no, not this time. And with down, their numbers increase. The planes in the air, and even more, we can start to see now dark shadows on the waterline. At the beginning, we thought those were our coastal boat patrolling, but they were so numerous. We could not believe they were ours. The shadows were getting bigger and bigger. The silhouettes of small and large ships were covering the water. New bombers formation fly now above our head. The first bombs were dropped by Port-en-Bessin. Once again, the bombers were approaching my position. I was in my buried bunker. In front of me was the heavy machine guns on its bearing pits. 3 firing openings we turned towards the sea. I was checking and checking again, once again, my cartridge bands, and I concentrated on my weapons to avoid thinking. Now the bombers were above our head, too late to jump to our shelters. I made myself very small to hide under the machine gun platform. The bombs went deep in the ground, making tremendous noise, and sand and gravel and dirt projections. We were plunged in mud and smoke. The ground shook, our eyes and nose filled up of dust. Sand crept under our teeth. All hope of help was lost. Our planes did not show up. We had no anti-aircraft guns in that coastline section. The bombers could drop their mortal load in total impunity. In the meantime, heavy naval shell blows. From a trench, I had the opportunity to see how the bombers were dropping their murderous loads on our position. Bombs and shells penetrate the ground, projecting clouds of earth, barbed wires into pieces, blocks of concrete, and that was not all. Now the enemy fleet, is approaching in the morning age, which will be worst for our WN. For us, start a no-end combat. It may be the last desperate situation which conducted us to fight so furiously and tenuously to save our life. We just wanted to survive. A fleet spear out as far as we can see. Big warship seems to be in the front of our like parroting. The show was for the few ones who survived the landing bombing preparation. This has been a unique but terrifying experience. Salvos after salvos, the naval artillery was obliterating our position. The ship were no less than 12 miles away, and that distance diminished minutes after minutes. To the naked eye, we could see better and distinct the details of the fleet. The falling hail of shells hitting our position was no more violent than ever. More and more clouds of earth flown in the air. The mine protection belt on the beach has been breached by the shelling. The mines and the wooden logs with mines on top were scattered along the water line. All in the landing fleet witnessed a prodigious deployment to what we were unable to oppose any resistance. Our heavy guns were to fire on a short range, forcing us to wait until the enemy was close enough. So far, we only had anticipated a high tide landing. As a low tide, the vessels would have run around on the sand. Despite that, they landed at mid tide, about 300 yards away from the bluff. Bombs and mainly shells turned upside down our position. But so far, we didn't lost too many men. In the middle of that hail of shells, we used each second possible to establish connection with our companion. About 45 feet ahead was a 2-inch anti-tank gun. The gunner was alone and his assistant was wounded. About 120 feet on my left was a single guy like me with his machine-polished machine gun, Hans Savallo. During that gunfire, the landing fleet was close enough to make all the details obvious. Next to the warships of all types, there were troops carriers, landing barges, assault barges, to transport the landing troops ashore. Suddenly, by 6 a.m., the gunfire stopped simultaneously. That resulted in a very worrying quiet and long silence, but didn't last too long, at least long enough. Again, the ship restarted their shelling. The shell whistles above our heads, and then a real deluge of short-range shelling on the beach defense. The tree trunks were jagged, some were burning slowly. Feet after feet, the rolling artillery barrage was advancing on us. A monstrous walls of fog and smog twisted around with deafening cracking, howling, hissing and screeching, gnawing down everything, and that death screen was advancing towards us, advancing slowly, like if he knew that we had no chance to escape him. With no safety and no salvation possible, I was still under my machine gun basement. The first shells of that stem roller start to hit our position in between our machine guns and bunkers. Overs squeeze in between my bunker firing narrow windows. Our remote control flamethrower installation were pulverized. Under that hail of shells, I tried to contain my fear with short prayers talk loudly. Above us and next to us, there was like drums rolls and cracking, splinters flying, whistling and screaming. They chatted against the wood or the concrete or buried themselves in the dirt with thud. The silence returned. Once again, whistling and rasping happened around us. We were 6 left on about 200 feet. Comrade Siegfried Kuster, the anti-tank gunner, crawled down to my bunker and screamed, "Be careful, friends! They are coming! They coming!" Then the sea surface animated, the assault and the landing special barge approached the beach. The first landing troops piled up tight on boats rushed out in 3 feet of water, sometime up to their chest. A race started on the wide beach, with no protection until they reached the shingle bar, offering a first little shelter. It would have been senseless and useless to try to respond to the air and naval bombardment. We only fought to save our lives in the bunkers and in the group holes as long time as possible. The first run fires call us to our duty, and we start firing. The occupants of the first assault boat and landing collapsed dead or wounded after a few feet on the beach. Some barges were floating with no coxswains on the water. Very rapidly started to repose of the landing guns barges, the LCGs, which were equipped with rapid shots guns and heavy machine guns against our position and isolated the gun position, while the naval long range was obliterating our inland supply line. With my heavy machine guns MG42, I did several rounds against the landing craft and jammed because of the muddy cartridge bands from the bombing. I moved it, I cleaned it, and shot again and again. I still cannot understand how so few of us managed to stop the landing for a while. This dramatic experience helped to understand the trauma of our families back in Germany, who for months went through that we have experimented for a few minutes. Hard to think about our civilians with no way of defending themselves. At least we could defend ourselves, and we want to survive. On the west side of my position, the 3-inch guns was shooting shells after shells, non-stop, and was rapidly engaged by the approaching naval force. The firing opening was screened by the fog and the smoke of the exploded shells. Few went inside and put the guns out of commission. The gun crew was slightly wounded and managed to escape their position. About 60 feet next to the 3-inch gun was another MG42 speedy round machine guns, which has been very effective against the coming waves of invasion. The two men who escaped, guess what? I met them back in 1994, coming back at the German cemetery at Lacombe. About 120 feet behind me was the house which housed our command post, the kitchen, just been destroyed by the naval shelling. Countless shells still explode, and pieces of wood and walls remains were thrown constantly in the air. About 45 feet ahead of me, toward the beach, was a pit with Custer anti-tank gun. No obvious from the sea view. Siegfried was taking the beach in enfilade firing from my WN-62 and 261 position. Many aflame tanks and boats prove that this soldier did stop the enemy progression toward the inland, passing over the shingle wall. He was a veteran from the Eastern Front and was perfectly trained. Those coat and fire tanks and barges were mentioned by Ernest Hemingway. In the meantime, the second wave arrived. A new race started on the beach. Once again, the strong point defenders protected their position, but the defense was weaker and weaker. More and more comrades were killed or wounded. The tide was coming slowly. The water was coming to the top edge. The troops' run was shorter. Landing ship tanks were coming ashore, opening their ramps, letting the tanks driving quickly across the beach, shooting along the way. Since few hours, the combat was going back and forth. The beach was covered by body, dead or wounded, trying to find some cover. Water was still coming up. All of those who could crawl or run tried to reach the shingle wall. There again, many fallen under our defense. On our side too were many losses. The light wounded were taken care of and sent to the rear. The dead one stayed on the ground. Nobody had the time to take care of them. Numerous soldiers were now reaching the shingles, used as a shelter. There they fought to be safe, but for a short instant. Our mortars did wait that instant to start the barrage firing on the flintstone around. The shell shrapnels, the gravels, the flint shrapnels occasioned the landed troops heavy losses. The tide was now bringing many dead and wounded soldiers with all kinds of debris and pieces of shipwreck. It was a scandalous vision to see waves of men sent to death. Peter Buchanan, a student from Michigan, USA, found in a scholar book the following text: "The U.S. soldiers advanced like robots, throw fire from defense to the German position." In his idea, the reality of rush into death like robots was not imaginable. We were within earshot before them. By noon, the high tide reached the shingle wall. The landing barges were around 300 feet away from us. We reached our rifles and tried to stop their progression. We were the last ones to hold our position. All the other towards the west and the east has been conquered. We were pretty much encircled as enemy troops were attacking us from the inland. We had no reinforcement men. Michael Schnickel was sent to reach reinforcement. He never came back. There were furious combat already in Colville, no reinforcement possible. As Michael described to me after the war, he has at Colville behind a horse when the animal had been hit by a shell shrapnel. He was slightly wounded, but covered by the horse flesh and blood. What a spectacle for the Americans who found him in such a posture, lying in the horse body. Enemy was still storming the beach, and we almost had no more resistance. Few barges passing in front of our WN were still blowing up on fixed mines and wooden stick. Then arrived the bigger landing craft with lateral ramps along which the soldiers were coming down, named the LCI. They were filled of hundreds of soldiers. In fact, for the Model 300, there were 210 men. Once again, they shell our position. Siegfried Kuska, the cannon guy, came crawl to me with his rifle. He could not use his gun anymore, and he only could take the beach and enfilade. It still had plenty of ammo for his machine gun. The rolling artillery was going down on our position. We could breathe again. The LCI was a big target. Only 360 feet away, we shot several rounds to the ramp and to the bridge and create a real confusion. We could hear them giving order via their loudspeakers. Within 10 to 15 minutes, the barge left. Once again, we survived. We moved back to the main bunker, stopping in our personal shelter to grab a bite, as we didn't eat anything since the last evening. Reaching our new position towards inland, passing by burning grass and burning gorge shrub, I met in the trench two comrades, Helmut Kesseling and Paul Hemming, carrying a submachine guns and a rifle. Bullets were whistling above our heads, not only coming from the sea, but also from our west inland side. They listened me all our friends' losses. Looking at the WN-61 and 60 towards the east to our position, we could see landing troops walking Indian file to the top of the bluff. About 2 hours after the landing, the 3.5 guns 88s was silent. It was under Staff Sergeant Schnull, who I also met in 64 at Lacombe after the war. We decided that I will jump in the shelter to collect some war bread, sausage, and milk. My milk, which I usually get from a local farmer daily, but not that morning. Our initial June 6 plan was to dig trench extensions. This is why I was dressed with my working uniforms. My dog tag was still hanging at my bed. My military ID and documents were in my formal uniforms in my bedroom, such as my mother rosary. I also had a little box with a Lourdes medal given by my dad. He wore it during World War I, so I rapidly collect all my bits and pieces. Rifle, machine guns, and ammo next to us. We could appease our hunger, and first, with hastily mouthful swallowed a large sip of cold milk taken from the jar. I did not thought about the fact that the cold milk swallowed speedily in an empty stomach is laxative. After I relaxed briefly with two friends, I jumped out of the ditch over the embankment, sheltering me from the sea. Not to poop in my pants. I took off so quickly that I'd break my pants sewing. The belt supported by two straps, the bandolier, without forgetting pocket filled up with grenades, was too long to remove. Before I returned to my position, I saw 150 feet further along a hedgerow an anti-gun which was not there 2 days earlier. The cannon was pointing towards NWN 61. Two older soldiers saw me with my ripped trouser. Understanding my embarrassment, they told me to help myself in their reserve as they were not going new uniform soon. I never told them the real reason why my pants was ripped off. They told me I already had a friend sitting next to their position. We exchanged combat information and both agreed that we had no idea how we'll escape from that trap. During our conversation, our staff sergeant and WN commander arrived, crawling to skip the shooting line. Our sergeant was badly wounded in his back. On our left, towards the west, we noticed that WN 64 was under the enemy and the American infantry was already in the perimeter. Since I was a young soldier, age of 18 years old, I was listening the older soldier's recommendation before I hit back my assigned position. For 150 feet, I was protected by the hedgerows another few feet. 3 small jumps, and I will be with my companion. I come up to the edge, and the mount pulling on my hand, grabbing a root. My head almost overlooking above the dirt top, when I brutally feel a terrible pain to my pulling left hand. I fall back and realize that 3 of my fingers were still attached to the rest of my hand by the tendon. I did left my rifle halfway up the hedgerow, and without it, I was not feeling confident, and I went up again to take it with me. I ran towards the gun comrades arriving. They already had the bandage ready. I asked him to pay attention, and I wanted to keep my fingers. To comfort me, on the way to Colville, he said, "This is a good shot to go back home. We're happy that you can still run." Crawling and running, my rifle tight under my arms, I was rushing to Colville between the tall hedgerows. Hearing the raging combat in the village, shot and machine guns resound. At the village way in, I met other friends from my WNs who were wounded. Adversary was already penetrating in Colville. They were between us and Saint Laurent-sur-Mer, already at the farm. Many of our men were fallen by the church. Next to our Colville bunker, there were many dead soldiers' bodies, who were covered by a tent cloth. Only their shoes were obvious. I fell literally on the concrete ground of our bunker, in the shade, thinking the worst was behind, when my hand really started to hurt. I recognized my staff sergeant Pye with his voice. He was describing the battle and said, "I am the last alive of WN 62, nobody else alive there, I guess." He was astonished when I learned that I was still alive and under the barbed wire, being really badly wounded. I was about an hour later and I get wounded again. The Americans are in the church, just on time. We board a truck, leaving our dead comrades alongside a shallow ditch next to the road and hedgerows. With us was a French civilian. The truck was taking us to Saint-Honorine-des-Pertes by the coast road up the cliff. With the lack of trees and hedgerows, we would see the sea swarming of all sized ships. The big ones were connected to anti-aircraft balloons, which our inland long-range artillery was using as a marking point. The house by the entrance of the village were destroyed. We had to change itinerary and wanted to go to Bayeux Hospital, where in 1943 I stayed for 3 weeks to be cured from an infection. The driver wanted to drive back, using again the same obvious road. We refused and walked towards Etrium, where we had our major HQ. Arriving at Etrium, we noticed that a very well-hidden long-range artillery battery was not yet located by the enemy aircraft and was still shooting on Colville Draw. They only had few shells left, and they were not expecting to be supplied that day. The enemy had the air supremacy. We haven't seen even one German plane so far on that day. In Etrium, Corporal Kurt Wemaker was along the road in a bad shape. A bullet went through his ass. He was assisted by 2 French women were wrapping him with bandage. We stopped to the next coming farm, where the farmers give us milk and cider. Our staff surgeon ordered him to drive us with his horse and carriage to Bayeux. His wife and his children cry and ask us to let him at the farm and want us to take the carriage. She was terrified by the risk of the fighting planes in the air. Since the early morning, they were shooting on every moving thing. Now they were flying over the back roads. We noticed that by looking at the numbers of dead cows and animals in the fields, victims of the low altitude fighters. We finally left him and asked the French who were with us to drive the carriage. As soon as we get to the hospital, we were surrounded by French who were asking us if that was the landing. Amazed, we realized that the German first had left the town with most of the German soldiers. By the time we went back, the French who was conducting us disappeared. Now, where is the next German hospital? When we saw ambulances coming back to the hospital to evacuate the last wounded, who we joined.